Sountor Thomas sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the sleek glass doors of TCF Bank in Livonia, Michigan. The winter air bit at his fingers as he adjusted his coat, but inside, his heart was warm with anticipation. Today was supposed to be a turning point. After years of struggle, disappointment, and fighting for justice, he finally held in his hands the answer to his hardships: a settlement check. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that he had stood up for himself, that his voice had been heard, that the system had for once worked in his favor. As he glanced down at the checks resting on the passenger seat, the weight of his journey washed over him. He had spent months battling a discrimination case against his former employer. The long legal process had drained him emotionally. But today, as he prepared to deposit these checks into his account, he felt something close to peace. He grabbed his phone and checked his balance. The numbers on the screen barely reflected the years of hard work he had put in. This deposit was supposed to change that. It was supposed to mark the beginning of something new. A new home, a fresh start, a step into a future where he no longer had to fight, just to be seen. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, checks safely tucked in his wallet. The automatic doors hissed open as he walked inside, the warmth of the bank's heating system rushing over him. The teller at the counter smiled out of routine politeness. Sountor returned the smile, steadying his voice as he said, "I'd like to make a deposit." Little did he know this moment, the one he had been waiting for, was about to take a turn he never expected. Sountor slid the checks across the counter with steady hands, his heart pounding with anticipation. The teller, a young woman with neatly tied blonde hair, took them and began typing on her keyboard. Her eyes flicked between the screen and the checks, her expression neutral at first. The quiet hum of the bank filled the air, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the occasional rustle of paper. It was supposed to be just another routine deposit. But then, something changed. The teller's fingers slowed, her brow furrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She glanced at the checks again, then back at her screen. Sountor felt it. The shift. She hesitated, then turned slightly in her chair, whispering something to the assistant manager standing a few feet away. Sountor's stomach clenched. What's going on? The assistant manager, a middle-aged man in a stiff blue suit, walked over and took the checks from the teller's hand. He barely acknowledged Sountor as he scanned them, his lips pursed in thought. "Excuse me," Sountor said, trying to keep his voice even. "Is there a problem?" "No, sir," the manager said, but the way he avoided eye contact said otherwise. Sountor's fingers curled into his palms. He had been here before. This feeling, this tension, the way people hesitated around him as if waiting for confirmation that he belonged. He had been banking at TCF for years. His account was in good standing. The checks were valid. So why did they look at him like this? The manager took a step back and spoke into his radio, his voice low but firm. "Can you come to the front?" Sountor's heart slammed against his ribs. The teller avoided his gaze now, staring down at her keyboard. Customers nearby continued their transactions, oblivious to what was happening. But to Sountor, the world had just narrowed to this counter, this moment, and the unspoken accusation hovering in the air. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And then, the front doors opened. 2 police officers stepped inside. The moment the police stepped inside, the air in the bank thickened. Sountor felt it in his chest, a slow, crushing weight pressing down. He'd done nothing wrong. He knew that. But why did it feel like he had? The 2 officers, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other slightly shorter but just as imposing, walked with a measured pace. Their eyes swept the room before locking onto the bank manager, who gestured toward the counter where Sountor stood. Sountor's jaw tightened. "This isn't happening." "Sir, we need to have a word," the taller officer said, stopping just short of the counter. His voice was controlled, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Santore swallowed, keeping his hands in sight, his pulse hammering against his skin. The bank had called the police. Over what? A deposit? The customers behind him had begun to notice. Whispers floated through the air, cautious glances shot in his direction. He could feel their questions without hearing them. What did he do? Why are the cops here? Should we step back? He took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. Is there a problem, officer? The shorter officer spoke this time. We got a call about some suspicious checks. Suspicious? The word stung. He could feel anger rising in his chest, but he couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not now. They're mine, Santore said evenly. I just got them from my attorney. I'm depositing them into my own account. The bank manager shifted uncomfortably, but didn't step in. The teller kept her head down. Do you have any identification? The officer asked. Santore pulled out his driver's license and placed it on the counter. The officer took it, glancing at the information. Can you tell us where these checks came from? Santore exhaled sharply. It's a settlement, a lawsuit. They're legal, I can assure you. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the bank manager. Have you tried verifying them? The manager hesitated, then, with a shrug, said, We just had concerns. Concerns? Santore's fists clenched. He knew exactly what kind of concerns they had. He had walked in with money they didn't expect him to have, and that was enough to set off alarm bells. The officers exchanged glances. The room was too quiet now, the tension thick enough to cut. Then the taller officer spoke. We'll need to take a closer look at these checks. Santore's pulse roared in his ears. This was not happening. Everything inside him screamed to fight, to demand an explanation, to tell them that this was beyond insulting. But he also knew the rules, the unwritten ones. Stay calm. Keep your voice level. Don't give them a reason. Fine, he said, forcing his muscles to relax. Take a look. The officers stepped aside, speaking into their radios. The manager still wouldn't meet his gaze. The bank teller still wouldn't look up. And all around him, the whispers continued. Santore Thomas had come in today expecting a fresh start. Instead, he was being treated like a criminal. Santore stood still, his breath controlled, his hands resting on the counter, visible, harmless. The officers had stepped away to verify his checks, but the damage was already done. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Conversations that once filled the bank had quieted. People stole glances at him, then quickly looked away when he met their eyes. He felt exposed. He felt accused. All for what? For trying to deposit his own money? The assistant manager cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly before retreating to a nearby office. The teller still refused to meet his gaze, her fingers twitching as they hovered over the keyboard. Santore let out a slow breath and turned toward the nearest officer. How long is this going to take? We're making calls, the officer said flatly. No apology, no explanation, just a mechanical response. Santore clenched his jaw. He could feel frustration tightening in his chest, pressing against his ribs. How did we get here? This was supposed to be a good day. He had won. After years of being overlooked, mistreated, and denied opportunities, he had finally fought back and won. And yet, here he was, waiting, being investigated, being questioned as if he didn't belong. Minutes dragged. He considered pulling out his phone, but he knew better. A black man, standing in a bank, under suspicion, reaching for something in his pocket? That was how situations escalated. So, he stood there, still, silent, until the taller officer returned. All right, the officer said, handing the checks back. They're real." Santore let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I know." The officer gave him a hard look, but Santore didn't care. Not anymore. He turned to the bank manager. "So, can I deposit my money now?" The man hesitated. Then, with an air of forced professionalism, he cleared his throat and said, "Unfortunately, we won't be able to process these checks for you." Santore froze. He blinked. "What?" "We're unable to complete this transaction at this time," the manager repeated, shifting uncomfortably. "You'll have to take your checks elsewhere." Santore's fingers curled into fists. "You called the cops on me, treated me like a criminal, and now you're telling me I can't even deposit my own money?" The manager remained silent. The officers didn't step in. Nobody spoke. Nobody apologized. Nobody took responsibility. It was as if the room itself had decided that Santore didn't exist. His jaw tightened. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He could feel it rising, the fury, the exhaustion, the injustice of it all. But not here. Not in front of them. He grabbed the checks, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. The cold air hit his face like a slap, but it didn't matter. He had won once before, and now he was going to win again. The cold air outside the bank was sharp, but not as sharp as the sting of what had just happened. Santore gripped the checks in his hand, his mind racing. He had walked in expecting a fresh start, a moment of victory. Instead, he had been humiliated, doubted, and rejected. He stood by his car, his breath visible in the chilly air. His fingers itched to pull out his phone, to call someone, his lawyer, the media, anyone who would listen. But for a moment, he just stood there, letting it sink in. They called the police on him. They refused his deposit. They looked at him, a man who had just won justice in one battle, as if he were a criminal. His heart pounded with something beyond anger now. It was determination. Fine. They didn't want his business? He'd take it somewhere else. He climbed into his car and pulled out his phone, dialing his lawyer. The moment the call connected, his voice was steady but firm. "They refused my deposit." A pause. Then, "What?" "They called the cops, held me there, then said they wouldn't process the checks." His lawyer swore under his breath. "Are you serious?" "As serious as it gets," Santore said, gripping the steering wheel. "I need to deposit this money today. Can you get me another bank that won't treat me like a suspect for having money?" His lawyer let out a heavy sigh. "I'll make some calls. But Santore, this isn't over. What they did? That's discrimination. Plain and simple." Santore closed his eyes for a moment. He already knew. He had lived through discrimination before. He had fought back before. And if they thought he was just going to walk away quietly after this, they were wrong. "Call me when you have something," Santore said before hanging up. His hands were steady now. The game had changed. If they thought they could treat him like this without consequences, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Santore sat in the lobby of a different bank, one that his lawyer had recommended. Unlike the last time, there were no whispers, no hesitant glances, no police officers stepping through the doors. The teller, a middle-aged woman with warm brown eyes, took the checks from him and smiled. "Looks like you're having a good day," she said as she entered the details into her computer. Santore almost laughed. If she only knew. Within minutes, the transaction was complete. Just like that. No suspicion. No accusations. No waiting for validation that he was allowed to have this money. As he walked out of the bank, a weight lifted off his shoulders. But the fight wasn't over. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer. "They're going to regret this," his lawyer said. Santore exhaled, his grip tightening around the phone. "Good. Let's make sure they do." What TCF Bank had done wasn't just an inconvenience. It wasn't just about one man being turned away. It was about something bigger. The quiet, constant ways people like him were made to feel like they didn't belong, like their success was always under suspicion. Not this time. News of the incident spread fast. His story reached headlines. The words racial discrimination and banking while black were attached to TCF Bank's name. People were angry. People were paying attention. And soon enough, TCF Bank found itself facing another lawsuit, this time from the very man they had tried to brush aside. Sound Touré had fought for justice before, and he had won. Now, he was ready to win again. This time, the whole world was watching.